In our last episode of December, the historian Simon Sebag Montefiore described our guest today as the ultimate soldier scholar. He's been compared to Ulysses S. Grant, George Marshall, and Dwight Eisenhower as one of the great military leaders of American history. As commander in Afghanistan, Osama Bin Laden targeted both him and President Obama, as later discovered communications revealed that Bin Laden said of him, "He is the man of the hour," and killing him would alter the war's path. After the army, he went to run the CIA, and today is partner at KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, and has been referred to as the greatest president the US has never had. So you will understand why it is such a great privilege to welcome today to the Moneymaze podcast, General David Petraeus. David, welcome.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be with you.
First of all, a huge thanks for taking the time to have this conversation. And it seems particularly timely to review the landscape nearly a year on from the conflict in Ukraine. And we're very fortunate that the Moneymaze podcast is listened to and watched in over 100 countries. And though most of our guests are senior figures drawn from the world of finance and business, we're thrilled when we have experts help us understand wider geopolitical shifts and their potential consequences. And I hope that in addition to Russia and Ukraine, we'll have a chance to discuss NATO, China and its competing philosophy, Iran, threats to democracy, cybersecurity, and maybe a few other things. So let's go straight to Ukraine. And I guess the question is, can we start with your take on the situation right now?
Well, I think what's most important is that over the course of the last 10 or 11 months, the Ukrainian armed forces have seized the strategic initiative from the Russians. It began, of course, with an invasion by Russia, unprovoked, brutal invasion by Russian forces. They clearly vastly underestimated the Ukrainian forces, underestimated their president, underestimated their people, because all of Ukraine has mobilized, and President Zelensky has provided Churchillian strategic leadership. Keep in mind that a strategic leader has to perform 4 tasks well. Has to get the big ideas, the overall strategy right, has to communicate all of that effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization, in this case, the country and all the other countries of the world, has to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, has to drive the execution of the strategy, and then has to sit down and determine how the big ideas need to be refined, how to modify the strategy to do it again and again and again. He's done this absolutely brilliantly. But of course, all of the Ukrainians have responded magnificently. They see this as their war of independence, and that's how they're approaching it. So that you have total mobilization on the Ukrainian side, whereas you do not have that, obviously, on the Russian side. And on the Russian side, Vladimir Putin has performed miserably as a strategic leader. He got the big ideas wrong. His communications have been horrible, just grievance-laden, endless screeds about this and that, which are completely uncompelling, if you will, unconvincing. The execution has been abysmal. And then they obviously haven't adjusted all that effectively. Yes, there is a partial mobilization. Yes, there are various steps. Yes, he's finally put one person in charge. Yes, they, instead of 6 or 7 different advances, they consolidated and so forth. But by and large, still very much shooting behind the target and still failing as a strategic leader. We have seen the Ukrainians, much, of course, to Putin's surprise, who he thought he would topple the government, take Kyiv in a few days and go home to a victory parade. Instead, of course, the Ukrainians held them off around Kyiv. It was so painful, so costly for the Russians, they withdrew. So the Ukrainians won the battle of the capital of Ukraine, of Kyiv. They also forced the same action around 2 other northern cities in Ukraine, Sumy and Chernihiv. They ultimately, around the second largest city in the east, held them off there as well, and then launched a very, very impressive counteroffensive in the east, pushing down along the border between Ukraine and Russia, and then forced the Russians essentially to withdraw from the one provincial capital, oblast capital that they had seized in the south, and the Battle of Kharkiv, and took that back as well. The lines have been static, really now for several months. The Russians have impaled themselves on a city called Bakhmut, taken enormous losses trying to capture it. It's a geostrategically, if you will, at a sort of a tactical or operational level, important place. A number of lines of communications come through it, some mines and so forth, but they haven't been able to take it. And the sense is that the Ukrainians are doing what they have done far better than the Russians, which is to train, equip, actually recruit, for starters, recruit, train, equip, and then organize forces so that they can carry on further offensive operations. And again, they've done that so vastly better than Russia has that a country 1/3 the size of Russia has a larger and more capable army on the battlefield in Ukraine than does Russia. The question really is, can the offensive that they've already said they will undertake sometime in the spring, perhaps the early spring, can that make the kind of progress that could ultimately force the Russians to begin to crumble and maybe even collapse? Noting that, of course, the Ukrainians, again, are fighting for their homeland. They can look over their shoulder or in front of them and see what it is they're fighting for and the people they're seeking to defend and whose independence they're trying to preserve. The Russians obviously don't have that same motivation. The training and equipping process for the newly mobilized recruits is really quite poor, to put it mildly. The Russians have taken staggering losses, just incredible. Again, depending on whose counts you rely on, they've taken at least 6 and maybe as much as 8 or 9 times the casualties in the first 10 or 11 months that they took in nearly 10 years in Afghanistan, from which, of course, they ultimately had to withdraw when the USSR was still with us. The question really, I think, that we have to ask, and I constantly am asking myself, is what will it take to get Vladimir Putin to recognize that this war is unsustainable, both on the battlefield. He seems unconcerned by casualties, frankly. Again, some estimates are as high as 100,000 lost, again, compared with over 13,000 in Afghanistan over a course, again, of over 9 years. But also on the home front, where the economic, financial, and personal sanctions on Russia and his inner circle and export controls are continually tightened. The U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary is the one who oversees this. They just keep squeezing harder on all this, trying to avoid situations in which countries can circumvent various sanctions and export controls. Over 1,200 U.S. and other Western companies have either left Russia, many not to come back, or drawn down what they're doing. And certainly Russia's sent from central casting when it comes to resisting sanctions, because they have, they're one of the top 3 gas, oil, and coal producers in the world. The world still needs that to fuel the economy. They also have a variety of strategic minerals, agricultural goods, and so forth. So they're about as well suited to withstand these kind of sanctions as any country could be. But it is nonetheless starting to really impinge on the economy. And maybe they weren't down 10% in GDP over the past year. It might have been more like 5 or so. That is still very, very substantial. And I think it will bite more and more and more over time. So again, the question is, number one, will the Russians at some point crumble? And I've been in battles where the enemy ultimately did crumble, did collapse. And we tried to rewind the tape and say, what did we do? How do we create the same conditions that brought that about? It's very, very intangible. It's psychological as much as it is physical. If it will, when might that happen? What would the conditions have to be? And then when does Putin finally recognize that this is unsustainable, both in Ukraine and home in Russia? And what we need to do, obviously, together, US, UK, and all the other countries of NATO and the West, is provide everything absolutely possible to Ukraine to hasten that moment when he has to make that very tough decision. And then, and only then, could you have the kind of negotiations that could result in a resolution, which both countries need, by the way. I don't think either country wants to have a new frozen conflict, as the term was, after the Russians seized Crimea in 2014 and then supported the separatists and also provided Russian forces to take part of the country in the southeastern part of Ukraine and so-called Donbass. If it's just frozen, that means that Russia's still under the economic, financial, personal sanctions and export controls. And on Ukraine's side, they still might be getting pounded by the rockets, missiles, and Iranian-provided drones. Both of them need that to stop. And then on the Ukrainian side, there's going to need to be a Marshall-like plan to help them rebuild their country after the terrible damage that Russia has done to it. And there will need to be an ironclad security guarantee, whether it's from the U.S. and a coalition of the willing or NATO itself. Hard to say which one might be the most likely. But those conditions, those elements will be what will make a negotiated resolution both possible and necessary.
So that's terrific. And I just want to take one step back before we talk about that conversation that is going to take place at some stage, most of us would suspect, which was that I think it was Stalin who famously observed that in the Soviet Union, it takes more courage to retreat than to advance. Now, this isn't a Russian war of independence, but you've had lots of insight into Russian military capabilities for a long time. Have you been surprised by how poorly, as a force, they've been both led and been able to react?
Well, not entirely. And I might try modestly to note that prior to the invasion, actually in the week prior to the invasion, in an interview with The Atlantic, the magazine here in the U.S., I said that Russia would not take Kyiv, much less ever control it, which was a bit contrary to what even most governments and other pundits were saying. And in part, it's because I've watched the Ukrainian forces develop since 2014. I've been to the front lines in Donbass. I've been out in Kharkiv. I've been in Kyiv talking with their military leaders, the heads of their military industries, the leaders and so forth. The last time was shortly after President Zelensky was elected. So it's pre-COVID to be sure, but still they had made enormous advances. The US, UK, and other NATO countries had really put their shoulder to the wheel. Intelligence agencies were helping National Security Agency on the cyber side. And so they were dramatically improved, really just orders of magnitude better than they were in 2014. Then, of course, you have the beginning of this massive quantity of arms and ammunitions, beginning actually with the UK, with the first one on the ground with the NLAW, I think it was the anti-tank guided missiles, followed by then the huge number of javelins from the U.S., then also the shoulder-launched guided anti-air defense missiles and so forth. Those helped enormously in those early battles. And then we've always known that the Russians don't have a non-commissioned officer corps, that their logistics, once they leave a railhead, they're very, very good on the rail. Much better than we are, frankly, because they control it when they want to. They have entire units that just exist to facilitate this using their rail system through a vast country. But once they come off the rail, they have perhaps 1/4 or 1/5 of the logistics infrastructure, the organizational structure that we have that enables us to be expeditionary, to move and still continue to supply. They just don't have that. Where I was surprised was just the sheer ineptitude of the campaign design, taking on all these different offensives simultaneously, sort of a main effort, but not really. And then actually what did surprise me, because if I'd had months in the field with units as a commander, as they did, they were having maneuvers in Belarus and in Russia on the borders of Ukraine for many months prior to the invasion. I mean, I would have loved to have had that. We did have, fairly intensive workup, but once we got to Kuwait, it was a pretty brisk pace, and we were consumed an awful lot with just sheer logistics issues and preparation of the force in that regard, rather than big maneuvers and so forth, in which you could fine-tune combined arms operations. And the Russians turned out to be abysmal. They have still never demonstrated the ability to combine the effects of tanks supported by infantry who keep the shoulder-launched anti-tank guided missiles off them, supported by air defense, keep any kind of enemy aircraft off them, mortars and artillery, so indirect fire, and keep it very close to you in the front, but safely, obviously, which is an art form in and of itself. Engineers to reduce obstacles along with explosive ordnance disposal, EW, electronic warfare, to jam the enemy's networks, your networks keeping up with you, your logistics right up there, Aero Medevac and all the rest of this. They have just not demonstrated that whatsoever. And that's what a truly professional military does. And in that regard, again, just because they had so many months out there training, I was a bit stunned that they weren't better, that simple things like road movement tables, how do you have a 40 or 50 mile traffic jam to begin your war? Well, it's because you haven't planned well, and then your execution was even worse. So in that sense, yes. And I guess I did think there would be certain areas where just the sheer overwhelming size at the beginning, before we really began ramping up, before we started providing, way over 130 howitzers, for example, 155 millimeter heavy, 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition. These are staggering numbers. The high mobility artillery rocket system with, again, thousands of those rockets, and then the precision munitions for those that allow a round, on the dinner table that accurate at 80 kilometers from one of these HIMARS systems. And then the Excalibur precision munition for the artillery as well, about half that range. All of this. And then just as I mentioned earlier, the extraordinarily impressive mobilization of the entire country in Ukraine. The biggest of the big ideas beyond, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition, I'm staying right here in Kyiv and my family's staying with me, was, of course, we're all going to mobilize and all men in Ukraine are going to stay. Yes, if women and children have to leave because of the situation, that's understandable, but all able-bodied males are going to pitch in, and they did. And that's the biggest of the big ideas. We are all in this together. This is our war of independence, and we intend to win it. And then the recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and they're really doing real training. As you know, the UK, it's publicly known, is training units, not just individual soldiers. The US is doing the same. It's publicly known that we help them war game the offensive in the East at the War Game Center in Germany, at the training center in Germany, the same one at which we war gamed the invasion of Iraq when I was a 2-star general. And there's more of that going on. Now we're training them on the more advanced anti-ballistic missile system, the Patriot, and other air defense systems. So this takes time. The latest contribution by our different nations of infantry fighting vehicles will be very important. It will take some time to get the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians have demonstrated an affinity, a seriousness, a purpose about the training that is also absolutely, I think, unparalleled in my experience of trying to help other countries train their forces. And I've done that with a number of different ones over the years. They won't take coffee breaks. They rush through their meals. They want to get back to the training. They don't want to stop at 6 p.m. or something like that. They want to come back and continue because they want to go back to the fight. They want to defend their country, and they want to bring this war to an end.
But if one takes a slightly darker view for a second, and I think I've read you say that even a tactical nuclear situation wouldn't reverse Russia's inextricable position.
You're correct. Yep. No, you've done your homework. Because a tactical nuclear weapon, as horrific as it may be, and as crossing that threshold as significant as that is, has a tactical effect. Now, it can be depending on the yield, in other words, the explosive power of the particular munition that is selected, the particular nuclear device, that can be very substantial. But it's not going to reverse this stark situation that faces Russia, that they have lost the strategic initiative. And I don't think there's anything they can do to reverse the fact that Ukraine is out mobilizing them. Yes, they have a population that's several times that of Ukraine. But, when they did the last partial mobilization, more Russian men left the country than reported to the recruiting station. So this partial mobilization, this conscription, is not going well. They're running out of equipment to provide to these soldiers. They're not training them well at all. They're basically throwing them into combat And predictably, they are cannon fodder when it comes to the skill that is required for this. So that doesn't mean, again, that those numbers don't matter. Cannon fodder can hold you up, especially in urban settings where if they get dug in, it's very difficult to get them out. But that doesn't give you confidence that they can remedy the situation that has been so troubling for them, which is the inability to generate combined arms effects. And so the way they achieved additional ground after these early failures, noting that they did seize ground down in the south and they did eventually take Mariupol, key port city on the Sea of Azov and so forth. But what eventually they've done is they just run into the Ukrainians, they stop, and then they just hammer with artillery, mortars, other forms of indirect fire, occasionally some close air support, although that has been abysmal as well. They've never achieved air superiority, much less the kind of air supremacy that we have enjoyed really for a number of decades. And they just hammer away, and they do what they did in the Battle of Grozny. As you'll recall, they essentially destroyed the city to save it. It did the same thing when it came to the Battle of Aleppo. That's not the way that you proceed effectively and efficiently and impressively. And oh, by the way, even if you take that location, what you've done is destroyed it. And it's not of as much use to you, to put it mildly, as it would have been if the infrastructure hadn't all been collapsed.
So when we had General Carter nearly a year ago, he, of course, observed that nearly all wars end in a conversation, and you've obviously hinted at that. Can we just get your feeling as to what a compromise agreement might look like? Presumably, there's no concession to the pre-March 22 boundaries.
Well, again, this is a sensitive topic, and I must confess that I'm reluctant to get into that because you have a country that's fighting for its life, fighting for its independence, fighting for its survival. And even to hint that there might be some kind of territorial concession seems just untoward. But at the end of the day, that might be a feature. Again, it depends where are the lines when Vladimir Putin realizes to his horror that this is unsustainable. And as I mentioned, the condition that will be necessary is that he, Vladimir Putin, recognizes he just can't keep going on this way. And again, there could be various factors on the home front, including ultimately, perhaps at some point, pressures to topple him or to challenge him or what have you, as dangerous as that is, of course, to those who might consider that. As you know, there's a bit of an epidemic of, I think the term is window cancer or something like that, of people falling out of windows who think the wrong thoughts about him. But again, that I think has to be the realization that allows negotiations to go on. And then on the other side, there may have to be a realization that, okay, we can put Crimea at risk. We definitely should help them do that because there are important air and naval and other bases and logistical lines of communication going through there. But again, what about it? Do we keep in mind that President Zelensky, prior to the invasion, had put forward the idea that Ukraine would be neutral. There would be no NATO, no Western forces on it. It would give up on the aspiration to be part of NATO, which was in their constitution, as I recall. And there would be some kind of, we rent Crimea to you for a ruble a decade or something like that. So there was some willingness at that point in time. Now, whether that is still possible in the domestic politics of a country 95% of whose citizens want to see all of Ukraine liberated or not, we'll have to see. But again, I think that may be a component because, again, on the Ukrainian side, the desire, the need, the imperative, the desperate need for a Marshall Plan and a security guarantee. And in that regard, I, again, may be a little bit ahead of some others, but, we were always very sensitive. We don't want to arouse Putin's ire. Hey, that didn't work out. And I'm sorry this time, Vladimir Putin, but you don't get a vote on this anymore. And we are, whether it's the US and UK or others or all of NATO, and that could be slightly challenging given Hungary and Turkey and some others, which of course are holding up the accession of Finland and Sweden, but they'll get into NATO. This will happen at some point in time after sufficient concessions. Ukraine might be a bit more challenging in that regard. So again, we'll have to see where we are at that point in time. These dynamics obviously are constantly changing. But that's what I think. And so General Zimnikin, my old partner from Afghanistan and great comrade, who commanded more American forces, by the way, in combat than any other British commander prior. We totaled him up, and yes, Montgomery had a lot under him, but I'm sorry to break it to the Montgomery clan. Nick had more until we split that command in half. You may recall it was Kandahar and Helmand and some others. It was so big that we had to divide it in two. But again, he's exactly right, as he typically is on these issues.
So, big picture question. What are we learning about war in this century? Is tomorrow's war, when wars are sort of a juxtaposition of old and new, or something else?
Well, it depends. It depends where it is. And in fact, your countryman, Andrew Roberts, actually now Lord Roberts of Belgravia.
Belgravia, yes.
I believe he and I are working on a book. We're just finishing it titled Conflict. And it's the evolution of warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And then what will the future of warfare look like? I think the way to describe Ukraine is that it has glimpses of the future, but only glimpses. And by and large, it is fought the way we prepared to fight the Cold War, if it had ever turned hot back in, say, the mid-1980s, when I was a major, on the inner German border there with a brigade operations officer of, two M1A2 tank battalions and two M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting battalions as well. And it's that kind of war, really. Most of the hardware is roughly of that vintage. You do see glimpses of the future, however. And in that regard, you see the advent of drones, but these are very modest capable drones. These are not the frontline Reaper or even Predator. They're not long range. I don't believe many of them are being flown with satellites to extend that range. It's largely line of sight communications. And the capabilities, again, are fairly modest, whether it's the surveillance, or the actual strike capabilities. So think of the drones, which are being used also, of course, as forward observers for artillery and rockets, very precise ones. And then think also of just the environment in which everyone has a smartphone and their social media. So the open source intelligence, as it's termed, the visibility of this is unparalleled. I mean, it's completely unprecedented. But now put it into a scenario where you just don't shoot 80 kilometers precisely. You can shoot many thousands of miles. And by the way, at hypersonic speeds, think of these swarms of drones, but they're really, really capable swarms of drones. Maybe they're even stealth technology, and again, can be controlled over vastly greater distances and have vastly greater dwell time. And now you start to put together something that is really a bit almost scary. If you apply the old adage from the Cold War days that we used to all recite, if you will, it was, if it can be seen, it can be hit. So you always had to conceal and camouflage and make sure they can't see you. If it can be hit, it can be killed. The truth is, back in the Cold War, we didn't have drones. We didn't have all that great capability that we now have when it comes to intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, not remotely. And the precision of the munitions really hadn't yet. That started to emerge in the Gulf War, where we had all of a sudden you have the sort of video war and all the rest of that. But even then, the vast majority of the munitions were dumb, not smart. Fast forward to today's day and age, put yourself in an Indo-Pacific theater, which is, of course, much more maritime and air. And if it can be seen, it can be hit. If it can be hit, it can be killed. The implications of that are very profound. And it drives you to recognizing that we must transform our militaries from very large, exquisite, incredibly capable, heavily manned platforms, read aircraft carriers, but even, F-35s, main battle tanks, whatever. Because if they can be seen, they can be hit. And if they can be hit, they can be killed, to vastly greater numbers of very small, still very capable, largely unmanned remotely piloted or even algorithmically piloted, where at some point in time, the human in the loop becomes the human who designed the algorithm and maybe pushes a button that says, okay, machine, you can actually carry out the algorithm. I'm now out of the equation. Because I stay in the loop, you're going to lose to the other machine because that human won't be in the loop and have to make the final decision. This is a very, very profoundly different world. And then think of adding to that all that will be going on in cyberspace, a whole new battlefield domain where there's war going on every day, but where the intensity would be vastly greater, trying to disrupt the networks that tie together all these sensors and shooters and algorithmically piloted systems and swarms and so forth, and stealth, and the speed at which they will travel when you get into the world of hypersonics is, a little bit terrifying as well. So, but to come back to Ukraine, I think this just gives glimpses. And what you have to do is say, gosh, if they can do it at 80 kilometers, imagine what happens if you can do it again at thousands of kilometers, and we can. It's just that neither Ukraine nor Russia Russia has some of these capabilities, but relatively modest numbers and relatively modest capabilities when it comes to the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance component of it, compared to what it could be if you have the two great powers of the world employing the systems that are really now coming into our arsenals. And the resilience that implies is needed as well, by the way.
Yeah. Well, before we travel east in a minute, let's just pause on NATO, if I may. I think the US has, in aggregate, financially and materials provided essentially 2/3 relative to Europe's 1/3. How would you like to see NATO evolve?
Well, I think endless numbers of presidents, secretaries of defense, military commanders in the US have hoped that NATO countries in Europe in particular would do what to some degree is being done now. Germany, which was not even at 1.5% of GDP being spent on defense, all of a sudden rockets to 2% and even has a $110 billion equivalent for readiness, and also for the first time ever provides lethal equipment to another country, et cetera. So you're seeing real dramatic change. But at the end of the day, still, as you noted, in fact, it's even more than you noted, because the U.S. doesn't just spend more than all of its 29 NATO allies put together right now, soon to be 31. It spends more than 3 or 4-ish times as much. And so that is a vast gulf. And yes, our economy is vastly greater, but again, there should be even more defense spending by Europe, by NATO countries. And, a number of them, France in particular, puts forward the notion that we should be, determining our own defense priorities and capabilities. Okay, yeah, let's see it. Do it. But don't reorganize what you have now and create a new headquarters to oversee them. How many additional battalions of either infantry, cyber, space, you name it, whatever it is. But it means new capabilities, not just new concepts or theories. Now, again, to be fair, I don't think NATO unity has been what it is now since the end of the Cold War. And I was also at one point in time the speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And I remember how, in fact, it was during the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement period. And, the unity was just extraordinary. And the wall came down, the USSR collapsed, dissolved, Warsaw Pact fell apart. A number of those countries started moving into NATO eventually. But NATO was in search for, a reason to live, if you will. And no one has done more to make NATO great again than Vladimir Putin, ironically, even though he was setting out to make Russia great again. And of course, pushing Finland and Sweden into seeking accession to NATO is very, very important geostrategically. The Baltic becomes a NATO lake now, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at the Arctic and so forth, which is a new battlefield of the future, if you will, or at least a field of competition in the future, very, very significant action. So what he's done to reunify NATO, to give it, again, this reason to live, a real serious mission, has been extraordinary. But, we would like to see more done nonetheless.
So I think you've nicely encapsulated the Euro situation, the wider European situation. But then let's talk about China. It's been described as the chronic challenge. Others would see it as asserting its own view of its rightful place in history. How do you think the competing political philosophies can coexist?
Well, what there have to be is essentially an agreement on, here's where we're going to work together. Here's where we're going to compete. Here are the, if you will, the rules of the road so that the competition doesn't turn into conflict. And recognizing that would just be completely unthinkable, really. It has to be unthinkable. And our efforts to ensure deterrence, keeping in mind that deterrence is a function of two elements. It's a potential adversary's perception of your capabilities on the one hand, and we have to transform those, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure that they are credible. And then your willingness to employ them on the other hand. There can be no doubt about that. And so we have to keep that in mind all the time. I do believe that the current U.S. administration is doing that, even though I very much disagreed on the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and then the execution of that decision, which I felt had global repercussions, as do many other leaders around the world. I remember, in fact, one time when we had the red line that wasn't a red line, as it turned out, in Syria, prime minister of a very important country in Southeast Asia said, General, that stuff reverberates out here. And when it comes to this very important component of the potential adversary's perception of your will, that calls that will into question. Now, for better or for worse, the response led by the U.S., very impressive, to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, I think has pushed that into the rearview mirror and shown that U.S. leadership is not only absolutely vital and necessary, but it can actually be deployed in a very impressive manner. So, but we have to recognize there are different ideologies, there are different approaches to governance, economics, social activity, and so forth. But what we've got to do is make sure that what is termed a severe competition by the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who's an understated guy and a brilliant guy, severe competition cannot turn into conflict. And we have to ensure that, despite the different objectives of the two sides when it comes to certain issues in particular.
And might there be a possibility that in thinking about this new bipolar world that will sort of reemerge, but with China on the other side from the US and NATO, that Xi Jinping maybe is overestimating his own invincibility and layering on top of that, the extraordinary, and you'll be very familiar with it, but the World Economic Forum, I think, has essentially the Chinese population going from 1.3 billion to not much more than 600 million by the end of the century. Yeah. It's a shrunken state. How do you think about that?
Well, China faces a number of challenges. And the question I think a lot of us are asking, keep in mind that I'm the chairman of a global institute for one of the world's biggest investment firms. We've raised the biggest funds in history of any firm, specifically for Asia, I think now 2 or 3 consecutive times. So we are very keenly focused on issues out in Asia, including in China. And the question, I think, is, can President Xi and his inner circle, but especially he, because he is now an unprecedented third-term president, perhaps more terms, perhaps president for life. And of course, actually, the really important position is the party leader, because that's what he was reelected to do, and then goes with that as the chairman of the military commission. And then actually, it's not until a few months from now, I think, that they'll gather and actually reelect him as the president of the country. But the important question is China a learning organization? Because at least from an outside perspective, one can ask, was zero COVID a wise domestic policy? Well, they've actually thrown it over. And of course, there's enormous repercussions of that. The deaths of which are very proud that there were, very, very small numbers. But the price of that policy in the absence of an mRNA vaccine and very high rates of vaccination with the elderly in particular. In the absence of that, it was predictable that the death rate would skyrocket, and it will. And I think it ultimately will surpass that of the United States, which has lost well over 1 million U.S. citizens to COVID. They reversed that. And again, I think the right decision, albeit, if you will, a very, very difficult one, given how much that was embraced and how unyielding the approach was to zero COVID. Can that be applied to, if you look at some of the other activities from, again, an outside perspective, and keep in mind that that's not the perspective. Theirs is different, and it has to do with party dynamics and, if you will, domestic politics there. Is wolf warrior diplomacy a constructive, positive approach for them? Well, perhaps domestically, but, it's caused the EU to shelve the investment agreement. It's caused a number of other countries to respond to that as well. Is beating up Indian soldiers on the line of actual control, killing them actually, is that productive to the very important relationship with a country that's going to pass China, if it hasn't already, when it comes to the largest population in the world and one that's growing very rapidly? Economic coercion against countries like Australia because they asked to investigate the origins of a pandemic that was killing, at that time, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, now millions. The physical intimidation on the high seas, does this help the average Chinese citizen? The question is, can they come to the realization that perhaps it might not be? Noting, again, there are other dynamics which drove, again, China to these policies and to their implementation. But if such a significant policy as zero COVID can be reversed, could there be reversal of some of these others? And then could it be sufficiently sincere that we could all just have at least a more constructive, at least somewhat more mutually beneficial relationship, even as there is, again, a continuation in some respects of severe competition and domestic practices, if you will, when it comes to surveillance state and other issues that are at odds very much from what we believe is the right course.
So let's turn to another country who's couldn't be further away from Western values, and that's Iran. We had Sebag Montefiore, as I said, who described them as this evil regime. Major General Mick Ryan, who you'll know is commander of Australian Defence College, described it recently as a repulsive regime. And yet, rather extraordinary, at least here in the UK, bodies like the BBC are remarkably calm and uncritical of this regime that is carrying out untold horrors and where there may or may not be the beginnings of another revolution. What's the long-term game plan from the West vis-a-vis Iran?
Well, that's a very tricky issue because for the US, UK, other Western powers to actively be involved almost hands the regime the stick with which to beat us, or at least to beat their people. Because then they will say, you are just puppets for the Americans, the Brits, and this is not really acting their direction with their assistance and so forth. So I think that is the challenge that all Western nations face when it comes to determining how can we help those who are protesting against this repulsive, murderous regime, keeping in mind that hundreds of our soldiers were killed in Iraq from these explosively formed penetrators that were provided by the Revolutionary Guards Quds Force of Iran to the Shia militias of Iraq before we defeated them in the Battle of Basra and Sadr City and so forth in 2008. Keeping in mind that, of course, what they're trying to do in Iraq and also in Syria is to achieve what they achieved in Lebanon, to Lebanonize Iraq, if you will. So in other words, to have control of very powerful militias on the street. So you have street muscle, and then you have control of a sufficient bloc in the parliament that you can veto anything that you don't like, as again, they have achieved in Beirut. And that's very, very worrisome. again, what they're doing to their people is just, again, so far beyond the pale. And I'm hard pressed to say that you're going to see the regime overthrown anytime soon, even though there are some very, very impressive scholars. Kareem Sajidpour is one in the U.S. who has said, this regime is going to go down. And he is a very thoughtful, informed, incisive individual on the issue of Iran. And he's finally starting to get convinced that this regime is not going to survive. The problem is, of course, is it short term, mid-term, long term? I mean, eventually, all regimes and all people ultimately will die. But the question is, how soon? And I have been a tiny bit skeptical because what you have are people who are on the side of the demonstrators. They are unarmed. They're largely unorganized. I mean, that's one of their strengths, is that there's no key leadership that can be decapitated and end the regime the way it happened in the past, where they, put this individual in jail or house arrest and the movement withers on the vine. And they're not necessarily keen to die. They are taking enormous risks. Some of them are being killed, but they're not out just to purely be martyrs in this cause. And they're up against a regime that has massive forces. I mean, just the besieged militia alone is over 2 million thugs, basically, who can do everything with wield pipes on the street to weapons, who are very organized, are very highly equipped and have weapons, and are willing to kill. So the question is, when might these regime forces, the besieged militia, the Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds Force, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, which of course is in addition to the normal regular Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the other elements of the inner circle, when might they step back, as did the Egyptian army when Mubarak ended up in front of the bus, and say, we're not going to kill our own people, and we're just no longer going to be party to this, and say the oil workers go on strike as they did back in the final days of the Shah. This kind of indicator is just not there yet. It's not impossible that it could emerge, but the regime is so substantial that it's not a case where if the supreme leader goes down, they can all step back and retain their positions under the next leader, and the way the Egyptian army did with Mubarak. They might go down as well. And so that's the problem here. And as I said, the challenge for U.S. and Western countries is, how can you support them, perhaps covertly, clandestinely, without being exposed? How meaningful can that be, actually? Because you can't do it overtly without playing into their hands and making this into a struggle of the West versus Iran, which provides a rallying cry for the regime, almost a lifeline for the regime.
Yeah, well, that's very clear. I'd like to ask a couple of financial-related questions. In the war against Ukraine, the US authorities decided essentially to weaponize the dollar and froze Russian assets, which was perhaps unexpected by the Russians, which of course will have had other regimes thinking about dollar assets. Doesn't it undermine the dollar over the medium to long term because other competing blocs feel less inclined to have as much in dollars because they've seen what can happen?
Well, having taught economics back in the day, as well as international relations and some other subjects, but especially as an economics professor, I learned you can never go wrong by saying it depends. But it does depend. It depends on, are there any alternatives that truly are as attractive, as stable, as dependable? And the answer to that, I think is not really. So you might see a sort of a tactical shift, a little bit more in, I don't know, the euro, the pound, the whatever it might, even maybe a tiny bit in the renminbi or something like that. But there's no sign, I don't think, of true displacement of the dollar as the currency through which much of trade is done. What's ironic, of course, is that other countries, some adversaries, and even corrupt individuals all rush to get their assets into the dollar because you actually have rule of law, transparency, and all the other qualities that give you confidence that you can actually invest in it or in commodities, whatever, securities, assets, equities, you name it, real estate in that dollar, and it's going to turn out better than it would in other currencies. And so the irony is that Russia, thinking that it was going to sanction-proof itself, stashed $600 billion around the world, including $200 billion in China. And then every country froze those, including China, by the way. And China, for all of the declarations of partnership without limits that were made prior to the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, as you'll recall, at the beginning of the last year, even China has not unfrozen their reserves, has not violated export controls in any meaningful way that we're aware of, and really has not been a partnership without limits. There have been limits, even as they are very happy to exploit the moment and get yet further advantageous deals on natural gas or oil or what have you from Russia at Russia's moment of weakness.
So as a former economics student, I have now taken some notes from a former economics professor. Thank you. We want to just go back to cyber crime. You just alluded to it in an earlier conversation, and I was chatting to Rob Rooney, he's a friend of the show and the former chief executive of Morgan Stanley in Europe. And he said, essentially, do you believe that the major players are acting in a similar way to mutually assured destruction in the Cold War because they have the capability to shut down enemies' critical infrastructure and financial systems, but won't press the button?
That's the theory. And again, I think it's a theory to which the major powers, in a sense, should ascribe, whether or not it is true, if you will. Again, I think that we have certain capabilities. I know we have certain capabilities. I think we have others, but we don't know until we actually try it. So you can have, this is not candidly quite as precise as, say, an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead on it, the yield of which we know and the target of which we know. And if it goes through, we can literally predict the casualties, the collateral damage, and all the rest of that. Cyber is much more ephemeral. In fact, one of the challenges that we have is we have declared that there is a new battlefield domain, cyberspace. So, you had ground, then you had sea, and you had air. There's the subsea, what part of the maritime, and then there's outer space is yet another new domain. And cyberspace has been added. But how do you deal with cyberspace? This is not quite a geographic combatant command the way that, say, Central Command was when I commanded at the Greater Middle East. It's just there. It's how do you grasp this? How do you conceptualize it? So, okay, that's their area of responsibility. How do you even draw lines? How do you divide authorities? Who's the main effort? Are they the supported command or the supporting command? These are very esoteric, very sort of philosophical, except that this is what you have to come to grips with when you are conducting operations. And again, we know there are certain capabilities because we've actually used them. We've also prevented the enemy from using others. The reality is we do fear certain actions, certain capabilities. They fear certain actions and capabilities. And it does have somewhat of a deterrent effect, I believe, but no one would really know until they try it out. And by the way, let me point out that there was a huge fear that Russia would completely shut down Ukraine, would completely disable their telecommunications, their access to the internet, their communications ability. And they threw everything at Ukraine, and it didn't succeed. Yes, there were disruptions. Yes, there were various issues, but Ukraine had gotten better in cyberspace and cybersecurity, cyber resilience as well. And there's an open source. Microsoft actually put out a study. It was actually introduced by Brad Smith, the president. It's available on the internet that lays out the magnitude of what Russia did. And it was very, very substantial, and it didn't work. Now, it was a close run affair in certain respects. Civilian industry, particularly Microsoft, because it's so ubiquitous in certain areas, played a massive role in this. But the fact is that Ukraine got much better. The U.S. finally has gotten much better. You know, your National Cybersecurity Center was way ahead of ours. It was a model for what eventually has been built, Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. We're still building capacity and capability and additional authorities and appropriations and so forth. But it's getting better here, finally. It took us too long to make Cyber Command a full-fledged combatant command, too long to have CISA brought into existence and built up. But that has happened. By the way, again, we learned a lot. I visited the center headquarters in London and was hugely impressed. But all of that now does change the dynamics. And of course, there's a constant, if you will, cat and mouse between offense and defense in cyberspace. And of course, the offensive actor only has to, succeed once. It's a little bit like counterinsurgency. The insurgent only has to, penetrate one place. You have to protect everything. And that's true in cyberspace as well. And I think the reality is that we now recognize that every individual entity that has something that's really important has to have a designed, comprehensive, integrated, managed cybersecurity solution based on zero trust principles. Zero trust meaning that you can't, with one single password, you can't have free reign of the entire system. It has to be compartmented. And then you have to constantly update this. The management piece of this is very, very substantial. By the way, this takes about roughly 85 discrete capabilities, if you will, applications. I'm on the board of the largest pure-play cybersecurity services firm in the world, Optiv, which KKR owns. And we also have a number of other investments in many, many other cybersecurity firms and capabilities. So this is very, very complex stuff. And then it has to be augmented by the really, really big idea, which is sharing real time of information about threats and mitigation measures. And that's where we still are not where we need to be. That's where, frankly, Congress in the U.S. has been reluctant, for understandable reasons, to compel companies to immediately alert, say, CISA or some other organization. It takes hours, sometimes days. You've got to operate at machine speed, not at telephone or individual alert speed. And that's something we're working on. That's a huge conceptual issue because there are fiduciary issues in here as well. It can have effects on stock prices, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that we still have to resolve. Again, to be fair, the UK is ahead of us in this. The scale is more manageable. The authorities of a parliamentary system can be a bit more easy to manage and so forth. And, hats off to the Cybersecurity Center there, which also has an advantage that we can't replicate, which is about half the people are from GCHQ, your version of NSA. For us, NSA is an outward-looking, it's a foreign intelligence agency, not a domestic spying agency. And so there are limits to how much NSA can do in that regard as well. And that's a big advantage for your cybersecurity center.
What is it that clients and businesses with whom you interact most want to ask you and where you think you can most help them?
Well, it starts actually with just really imparting a recognition of the biggest of the big ideas about geopolitics. And that is that the world, just in the time that I've been at KKR, which is approaching 10 years now, we've gone from an era of benign globalization in which economics determined geopolitics. And geopolitical risk was something you did when you invested in a country the first time and didn't have an office there. The first time we went into Vietnam or, say, the Philippines, the former Yugoslavia, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Africa, you name it. And we evolved from that to a world of renewed great power rivalries where geopolitics now determines what's possible economically and in terms of investment and trade. It circumscribes, it constrains the context in which all of this takes place. Just for starters, that is a massively big idea. And if you can come to grips with that, and then you start to get into the more micro elements, and now you get into how do you apply that to specific relationships, specific regions, specific countries, and ultimately to specific industries, and then ultimately specific investment opportunities. And then you start to, there's a host of legal issues here, especially from a U.S. perspective. The entities lists in which you cannot invest, dual use technology areas that you can't get into, concerns about data and data flows, concerns about, again, the surveillance state activities. Will that contribute? All of this. And these are growing. And when you have the United States that puts the kind of restrictions on the export of advanced microchips, the fabrication machines, the plants and so forth that are used to make them, and the intellectual property that underpins all of it, which happens to be U.S., even though the most advanced are made, of course, in Taiwan and then in Korea, with machines made in Netherlands and Germany, but all based on U.S. IP. That is a very, very substantial restriction. And if that grows a bit more, and I think our sense is that there will be additional restrictions, but it will be higher fences around fewer items rather than many, many items surrounded by less high fences. So again, now you can understand what we as investors and we own about 120 companies around the world, which in many cases own other companies. And then we have minority investments in well over 100 additional. Now you get a sense of what they have to grapple with, how transformed the environment in which we're all operating together has been over the last decade, and what the implications of that are for specific investments in specific companies, specific industrial areas, specific countries, specific regions.
That's very helpful. And we actually had Philip Fries of KKR Europe, who runs the PE, your PE activities in Europe, on the show a few months ago, and that was very insightful to see, somebody's perspective.
And so, see again for his perspective, overseeing again the private equity investments in Europe, really in EMEA, again because it's also Mideast and Africa. But from his perspective, many of the investments that we did in the past in, say, the advanced Western European countries didn't really worry about geopolitics that much. They certainly do now because they have exposure not just to Russia and Ukraine, but also to China and also to a number of other countries where, again, in an era of benign globalization, you weren't worried. In an era of renewed great power rivalries, you have to be very worried. And I should just note that after 2014, we examined our European portfolio. So what is our exposure to Russia and Ukraine? Because we've never invested directly in companies in Russia and Ukraine, but we have, very substantial customers and actually numbers of workers, thousands of in each country, especially those that are working remotely in the IT sector, given the skills in cyber and so forth in both those countries. And then we revisited that back in 2020, when it started to appear that it might be possible that Russia would do what it has done, and then put in place mitigating measures. Okay, you want to stay in Kharkiv, which is right, the second largest city in Ukraine, right next to the border in eastern Ukraine with Russia. Well, okay, and you're reluctant to move. I got it, but at least pack your car with everything but your toothbrush. The minute something happens, take the toothbrush, get in the car, and drive to a location that you've already arranged, that is, someone can't snatch out from underneath you, and from which you can continue to do your job, ideally, if that is possible. And so, again, there was quite a flurry, needless to say, both within Russia and in Ukraine when it came to helping these individuals who are part of companies that we own or in which we are invested. But those contingency plans very much paid off.
Got it. Well, that was that business continuity planning that I think in the early days, many of us wondered whether money was being well spent. And recent events have absolutely shown that to be essential.
Very much so. Yeah. But of course, until it does, people think, gosh, can't we cut this cost? I mean, really, do we actually need to? This is something. But of course, that is ultimately proved itself very valuable. By the way, so has stockpiling of supplies and materials and components and raw materials and components when it comes to various manufacturing endeavors in which we used to practice just-in-time logistics. Just-in-time logistics no longer works in an era of pandemics, in an area when entire regions of the biggest manufacturing country in the world are shut down, in an area of disruption of shipping and various other supply chain elements. Now, unfortunately, we've gone from just-in-time logistics to just-in-case logistics again, which means that you're back in the business of warehouses and iron mountains and lots of, again, the various elements that are required for an individual manufacturing company to do what it does. And we've learned that you can't put all of your manufacturing and assembly in one location, because if it's shut down, then you're in big trouble. So you're also now seeing diversification of those when it comes to, for example, East Asia. You're seeing a migration in some cases from China to Vietnam to India to other Southeast Asian countries, Philippines, and so forth, none of which obviously has the capacity of China right now. But India in particular is building it. And then you also see the impact of the rising labor costs in China over the years as well. So and then you see the rise of the robots, which means that you can actually bring something back to the United States, do that task so labor costs aren't as big an issue as they were. And you can reshore or at least friendshore if you go to, say, Mexico or Canada. These dynamics also are part and parcel of what we examine, in that case, together with our global macroeconomics analysis team and our environmental social governance issues team as well.
Got very important advice for people working in conditions that are becoming more challenging. Now, I'm going to just move to some closing questions. I've heard your dog bark, so I know that somebody's impatient for me to get off this call, but I'm not quite going to let you go. But general questions which we always ask: if you could have dinner with one or two people unrelated to you, alive or dead, who would they be?
What's interesting, I was asked this question by the New York Times, of all things, about 5 years ago. And I said, I'd like to sit down with General Ulysses S. Grant. When it comes to the United States, in a lot of ways, he's the Wellington of the U.S. He is the only U.S. Army general to have performed brilliantly at all three levels of war. So the tactical level, which is sort of multiple brigades, say division command, this would be 10,000 people. Then operational level, multiple divisions. Then he's promoted. Now he's got multiple divisions underneath him for the Battle of Vicksburg, one of the greatest operational maneuver, high-risk battles in history, not just U.S. history, but all history of warfare. Magnificent. His trusted Lieutenant Sherman writes a letter and puts it in the official file. This is his closest comrade. And it says, essentially, I want it officially known that I think this is too high risk. And yet he pulls it off and he takes Vicksburg, which severs the Confederacy, and it opens the Mississippi River to the Union. Then Lincoln recognizes his brilliance. He brings him east through Chattanooga, battle above the clouds, which is also brilliant at the operational level. And then he's made the overall commanding general of the Union forces. He designs for the first time a comprehensive strategic approach, which in essence makes him the man who saved the Union, because that strategy won the victories that enabled Lincoln's reelection. A lot of people just think that it was axiomatic that Lincoln would be reelected in 1864. It was not at all. The North was very concerned about the continuation of the war, the massive casualties, the lack of progress. And there were draft riots in New York City. There were splinters between clubs in New York City. This is when the Union League Club broke out of the Union Club, which refused to expel Robert E. Lee from its membership, and the Union League Club to support the war effort while others were opposing it. So again, he could have lost. And the individual who would have beat him, McClellan, had twice had the overall command and failed, ironically. And yet the possibility was there that he could defeat Lincoln and he would sue for peace and just let the South go. And we would not have the Union that we have today. So it is accurate, as the title of one of the books by Professor Brands, which says, again, the man who saved the Union. And so in a sense, therefore, truly unique. And I just happened to be reading Grant Takes Command, a classic work by Bruce Catton, during the surge in Iraq, and I found it hugely inspirational. The sheer determination in the face of all of the challenges. And I don't want to equate Iraq to the U.S. Civil War, but for the commander, there were a lot of similarities. You know, you have tough casualties. You got Congress breathing down your neck. You got the White House asking, hey, when are we going to win the war? You got journalists all over you. You know, more than a few critical voices, host nation partners that are imperfect. Very, very challenging. And his approach, his genius to see a battle or an entire strategy unfold in time and space, and then convey directions to convey that to his subordinate leaders, his physical courage, and again, just this indomitable will, really, truly extraordinary. He captured maybe best by his worst battle, which is Shiloh. They did prevail. They owned the field, and the Confederate leader was killed. But they were almost driven back into the Tennessee River on the first day. They were surprised. Sherman, they're literally sort of clinging to the bank as Grant is getting reinforcements by ship brought down the river to enable them to attack the next day. And he's standing under a tree. All of the available shelter is being used as makeshift field hospitals. He can hear the cry of those whose limbs are being hacked off by the surgeons. There's others who are still out on the battlefield, wounded, crying out to be recovered. And Sherman comes out of the dark and he says, well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we? And Grant takes a stub of a cigar out of his mouth and says, yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though. And this just captures the kind of, again, sheer determination that is required of a commander. What makes a great battlefield commander doesn't necessarily imply greatness as a strategic leader. And again, if you look at Grant, those 4 tasks that, remember when we started, of get the big ideas right, get the strategy right, communicate it effectively, oversee the implementation, and determine how to refine them to do it again and again and again. Grant was flawless at that while in uniform. Yes, there were some shortcomings. Yes, there were issues with alcohol, to which Lincoln responded, find out what he drinks, give it to the other generals, at least he fights. And yes, in his presidency, there were corruption issues and some others, misplaced trust. But as the man who saved the Union, that's someone I wanted to sit down with. Now, the irony would be that he was famously a man of few words, and I'd have to coax them out of him over time. But that's, I think, that's the answer that I would want to give you on that one. And by the way, for what it's worth, somewhat shameless, but for your listeners, your viewers, I was a fellow at Harvard for 6 years, non-resident, part-time kind of thing. I've always had various academic things going on since leaving government. And in this one, we built a website on strategic leadership that describes these 4 tasks, goes into detail about the subtasks. You might actually put a link to it. If you go to the belfercenter.org, Harvard's Belfer Center, and Graham Allison, the great professor, was the head of it at the time, and then Google Petraeus on strategic leadership, it'll pop up. And if you can't find it, let me know and I'll shoot you the link. But it lays it out. And I found this to be a very, very valuable intellectual construct, and trying to perform those tasks discreetly. And it's not just in uniform. It's very much in the business community. I have a wonderful case in there. I recount of Netflix with Reed Hastings, who I think one of the great strategic leaders of our time, up there with the Jeff Bezoses and Jack Ma's and others. And then also the case of Kodak, where they had, 2,000 patents on digital photography, but failed in that fourth task to make the new big idea digital rather than film. And they've never been the same company that they were.
That's very interesting, and it's a slide that I use sometimes about the greatest consumer goods company not to exist today because,
Yes.
of missteps. Two final questions, and one which I'm going to put in the reverse order, which is what you've just following from what you just said. Are there any circumstances that could tempt you to enter into US politics?
Not politics. No, I've always, I stopped voting when I was promoted to 2 stars, I guess inspired by the actions of General George C. Marshall, the great, the architect of victory, as he's sometimes described, during World War II, the most trusted military figure in the eyes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I think Churchill as well, frankly. And it served me in good stead because there were periods where there was a suspicion that I was going to run for president. I was, quote, a celebrity general. That's not a term of endearment in the White House. But nonetheless, they kept calling on me. And I have clung to that. I firmly believe that the military, not only while in uniform, obviously should stay out of politics, have truly nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. But even in retirement, I think it's very unhelpful to those who are still in uniform for retired generals to be on stage promoting a particular candidate. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have views on policies. But those policies should be divorced from party politics and from individual political figures and should be rather the result of, a reasoned, hopefully objective, rational approach that you then try to communicate. Doing so in a constructive and respectful manner as is possible. And you've heard that here. I think this administration has done a very impressive job with respect to the response to the unprovoked, brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, and frankly, also in crafting a comprehensive, integrated whole of governments, S on the end, all of our allies and partners together in responding to the challenge of China and to the U.S. and Western relationship with China, while also noting that I, again, believed when the policy was announced that we would withdraw first the decision by the previous administration on the agreement with the Taliban and then to implement it by this administration, that we would come to regret that decision and that the outcome would be tragic, heartbreaking, and as it has been, I think, disastrous. So, but that's not party politics. That's not, and so therefore I can't find a home. Again, I've not yet even begun to register to vote, much less actually vote or support or contribute to and I do advise candidates and those who are in government of either party. And frankly, at a time when there is a degree of partisanship on Capitol Hill, especially in our lower house, I think it's actually helpful if you are not identified with one or the other parties, because each party can actually seek your advice without being concerned that they're getting the view of one or the other party. So no, I couldn't be tempted to enter politics in that regard.
Very clear. So that's a great place, I think, for me to let you go. I'm going to two more things. I'd like a shout out to Johnny Gray, who was, of course, commanding the Argylls in Iraq, and it's courtesy of him. He's a partner now at Ankura, the advisory firm. It's courtesy of him that I've had the chance to talk to you today. So thank you, Johnny.
My best to him and my appreciation once again to him for what he did back in the day.
Great. And secondly, this is a little family promo. My wife runs a podcast called Bandwidth Conversations. She interviews rock stars of life, and she has just interviewed and released an interview with Damian Lewis, who you remember was Band of Brothers and Homeland, and it's absolutely cracking. And I have to say, I know my place in the family now. It is. She spent an hour and a half with him in a really interesting conversation. So there'll be competition between the best Brewer family podcasts in January.
As that song used to say, it must be cold there in my shadow.
I know my place. And interestingly, I know Andrew Roberts. So the fact that you are writing this book together perhaps means that we can do something in the future when the book is out. And
it'd be a pleasure. Andrew is absolutely brilliant, incredibly productive. unbelievable, actually, and also delightful.
Yes. So, two pieces of advice. We always take some advice from the show. My goodness me, I've written down some quite a lot of points. One particular one, I love the way you express this when people worry about barriers because of the bipolar world. You said higher fences around fewer items. And I thought that was very nicely expressed.
And again, that is, in essence, how we characterize what the administration is doing when it comes to essentially export controls. And that's a very important concept because, again, given the magnitude, the significance of export controls on the most advanced chips, in other words, the smallest, this is where smaller is better, the most advanced IP and the most advanced manufacturing fabrication plant equipment, if that were to spread everywhere, of course, you would see massive decoupling between the U.S. and China. That we don't think is the case. And keep in mind, by the way, we didn't mention these ideas that we are in a Cold War or entering a Cold War or whatever. Well, again, we are in a severe competition, to use the term of our national security advisor, without question. But the Cold War has implications that just aren't found here. Or the contextual circumstances of the Cold War, where the U.S. and the West had very little trade, commerce, economic exchange with the USSR and even the Warsaw Pact. And so that, as a metaphor or an example, just it falls apart on that, though I understand what people are trying to convey when using it. But again, there should be an asterisk at the end of Cold War, noting that, we and China are each other's top three trading partners. And it's only because of the North American Free Trade Act Part 2, U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement now, that this united North American economy, that we have Canada and Mexico as our top two trading partners, but China's right behind. Occasionally actually nips up above one of those others. So that you cannot decouple. There is selective decoupling. That's the big idea here, not complete decoupling.
Got it. And for people who are interested in cyber, you've said Microsoft's Brad Smith has actually published a report on the Russian cyber activities in Ukraine, and we'll put that as a link on the on the show notes. So, although I could have gone on for much longer, General David Petraeus, I can only say thank you so much. I think our listeners are going to just be thrilled to have the chance to hear your perspectives on so many things. So, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, Simon. Thank you.